Yeah, they will settle. I think the best way to make everybody settle down is to start. So let me first introduce the moderator for the afternoon, somebody who's very familiar to us all in the club. So the comforting presence of a doctor in the house, Dr. KUNAL SARKAR. Please come. Come, Kunal da. And with him is Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Sanjeev Sanyal. They will be speaking about hidden histories with a specific focus on their books, The Ocean of Churn by Sanjeev Sanyal and An Era of Darkness by Dr. Tharoor. Over to you, Kunalda.
On behalf of the club, may I request our president, Wing Commander K.K. Biswas, to recognize our panelists today with the presentation of a flower bouquet. May I request you to start with Dr. Tharoor, who's at the far end of the stage. Followed by Sanjeev, who we welcome to our gathering this morning. And finally to Dr. KUNAL SARKAR. Thank you, sir. This talk is organized, as you know, by the library subcommittee of the club. We have one of the finest club libraries in India. And perhaps at the end of the talk, we'd request our two visitors to take a walk through the library to take a look. Kunal, over to you. Start.
Hello. Pradeep Malavika, thank you very much. A very good afternoon to all of you. You see, being a medico by profession, I hate seeing people in distress. So a few weeks earlier, when I encountered Malavika, who was in the search for a kind of intelligent, knowledgeable person to conduct this session, she was searching absolutely desperately. Her search is still going on. She actually hasn't found anybody. So, I'm just a kind of stopgap addressing the distress call. And if a search, she has told me that if she manages to find somebody more suitable, I may be replaced at short notice. So with that kind of statutory warning, we are all gathered here, 26th of January. To my mind, two very important events happened on the 26th of January. In 1926, a lot of interesting things happened in the district of Soho in England. Do you know where Soho is in London? Right. Perhaps not all of you have experienced all the entertainment it has to offer. But in 1926, the first television broadcast in the world happened from Soho in London. And a few years later, a young democracy was born in 1950. And when the democratic aspirations grew along with the media aspirations, it gave rise to a phenomenon called the nation wants to know. Right? And we were exposed to the unending monstrosity every evening from little pigeonholes. You had ill-informed, programmed people who had, fires warming up their posteriors, shouting at us endlessly. And from that time onwards, we promised ourselves that this discussion would be of a slightly different nature. There is utterly no need to introduce Shashi, who to my mind has been the best Secretary General that United Nations never had. And my friend Sanjeev, who really has been, it's very hard to describe him, whether he's more of an economist or more of an historian, but what I've found out is he describes himself as being a heretic, somebody who's interested in the economics of imbalance, and that's why annually he pays a pilgrimage to Calcutta. So I think, with imbalance, Calcutta, Bengal, everything thrown together, these two gentlemen are tied together with a common thread. One gave, in recent memory, one of the most vitriolic speeches ever given in the Oxford Union, and a speech was made into a book. And the other gentleman wrote a wonderful book, based on which he has gone on to deliver a lot of educative speeches. And that is where the ignorant doctor comes in, because given the 5-10 minutes a day, we can utilize the few remaining neurons, we educate and entertain ourselves given the facility of these two gentlemen. Now, at the very beginning, I would like to start off by asking both of them that, you seem to kind of, bear a bit of a grudge. The way history was written, history was presented, and was the kind of take you took on the colonial 200 years of India, was that already something going through your mind, or did the Oxford debate really trigger it? Was it kind of a de novo project? How do you look at it?
No, it's been going through my mind since I was a student of history at high school here in Calcutta at St. Xavier's. So, in fact, in many ways, when I delivered that speech, I was saying things I had believed and assumed were widely known in India for quite some time. Right. So I was astonished when the speech went viral around the world on YouTube, and then my publisher called me and said, "You must write a book on this." And I said, "For God's sake, why bother? Surely everyone knows this already." To which his reply was, "No, they don't, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral," which seemed to make sense, and that's how the book was born. Obviously, the amount of preparation you need to put into a 15-minute speech is somewhat less than needs to go into a substantiated and documented 330-page book. So I did do a bit more work on it, but the core arguments and beliefs I had been shaped 4 decades or 4.5 decades previously from my school reading onwards.
Shashi, if I may, I've really heard your speech a few times over, but I've honestly not heard anybody speaking against you. Did you actually have an opposition that day?
Oh, yes. No, in fact, on the same YouTube site, you'll find all the 8 speeches of that debate.
Oh, are they?
The 4 very respectable gentlemen, including my counterpart, the then chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, were all sort of, doing their best to sort of stand up for make the case for empire, as it were, the good things it did.
Was it?
But I think in the end, the voting by the audience was quite lopsided. In fact, they vote in the old-fashioned way by moving into different lobbies.
All right.
And so many tried to move into the lobby against the motion. I'm beg your pardon, for the motion, that is my side of it, that the reception that followed the debate was delayed by almost half an hour because they had to count each individual going into the lobby before they could come out and go to the reception. So it was a thunderous success, shall we say, for all of us.
Actually, post-Brexit, I don't know whether you're aware of it or not, you have given a lot of ideas to the British economy, because now they are suing the Italians for reparations against the Romans. So I think,
for feeding the Christians to the lions.
So I think, they will probably ask the Romans for some reparations, the Vikings, the Goths, everybody who's been there. So an entirely new line of economic regeneration has opened up. It's called the reparations economy. Now, Sanjeev, having said that, you were a bit unhappy as to where history has already been projected from the continental-centric. And, I mean, let's not mince words. I think, in your own words, the view from Delhi. Do you have any political aspirations? Right?
I don't have a mic, so I'll have... Yes.
Yes, a mic is essential for political aspirations, I'm afraid.
I've already failed at the first step. No, absolutely. So, in fact, there are all kinds of biases in our history. So, of course, there are the colonial era biases, and then there are Nehruvian era biases, then there are Marxist biases. But there is one bias that everybody has happily forgotten about, and which is that most of our history is written from the perspective of Delhi. So what happens is that you end up hearing about obscure dynasties like the Lodhis, who ruled over Delhi, but you have major chunks of our history relating to the rest of the country that are wiped out. I mean, so you can go through Indian school without having heard of the Satavahanas or the Cholas or the great maritime traditions of Bengal and Odisha or the Marathas. In fact, people forget that the British actually conquered India from the Marathas, not the Mughals. But the Marathas are getting wiped out of the history book. So the point I'm making is that there are serious lacuna in the way we tell our history, and what we've ended up doing, despite being free for 70 years now, perpetuated a huge number of colonial era mythologies, which we have imbibed to such an extent that we do not even remember that they are mythologies. So, we'll still hear about the Aryan invasion theory in our textbooks when, genetically, archaeologically, or even in any of the texts, there's, no sign of this. It is actually a colonial era myth created basically to tell us that,
If I just interrupt you for a minute, Sanjeev, what's been a little bit of a shock to the system, to the Amar Chitra Katha readers like I was in my era, the way you have kind of deconstructed Ashok.
Yeah.
Right? So, a few words about that.
Yeah, I mean, just one example which you mentioned, Ashoka. Now, everybody who reads Indian textbooks and grew up in India or watches television serials about him will come out to the impression that he was a jolly good chap. And yeah, he did a few things bad in the initial part of his reign, but eventually became a Buddhist and pacifist and so on. It turns out that almost all of this has no basis in evidence. He was almost certainly a Buddhist when he carried out the raid on Kalinga. Having carried out the raid on Kalinga, he is supposed to have become remorseful. But in fact, in Kalinga, none of his inscriptions mention any remorse. I mean, if you're going to be feeling sorry, that's surely the one place that you want to go and express it. And then there are many examples of massacres he carried out later on, which are clearly mentioned in a book called the Ashoka Vadana, which is a Sri Lankan text. So, when did he become a pacifist?
I think that's a good question. The lack of remorse almost sounds like demonetization.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, that's why we have a little bit of historical continuity, and that's what appealed to me. How can you do draconian things and have no remorse for it whatsoever? So that actually is a historical disease. Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Let me just briefly agree with the first part of what Sanjay said, because Sanjeev said, because I went to school in Bombay, Calcutta and Delhi and studied history in all places.
Can I
never
just interrupt?
heard...
every morning we went to school cursing you.
Oh, really?
Yes. You unknowingly, I was a mere statistic in the school, and you were epitome of virtue. And every morning, we used to have a bit of an essay, swaggled in front of us. This is how you should write. This is how you should speak. And the moment after senior Cambridge was over, we just said, no more of Shashi Tharoor. What a relief it was in St. Xavier's. You carry
Little
on.
did you realize I'd come back as a nemesis, as an author of books that you then have to read and discuss. But anyway, no, just to say that I hardly, Sanjeev is so right, I hardly, for example, heard about the Pallavas, the Pandyas, the Cholas, who were actually major figures. I mean, the Chola Empire, for example, engaged with Southeast Asia, both in terms of commerce, trade, conquest. There were naval battles fought by the Chola navies. And we never hear about them, whereas indeed we know about the Lodhis and various other minor kingdoms in the north, because the textbooks are written from a very northern perspective. So I would urge you all to actually demand more information about the great kingdoms of the south. Vijayanagar is barely mentioned. Vijayanagar at its peak was as attractive, significant, and certainly prosperous as the Mughal Empire at its peak.
Fair enough, again, since we are on this kind of, deliberation, you have talked about a few areas. Odisha, that we don't read a lot about, Kerala, a bit about Gujarat, and from those areas have come out some characters of which, honestly, we knew nothing about. Kharavela was one of them, Martandya Varma. Could you just highlight a couple of lines about these people who, till such far, was almost famous in their obscurity?
I'll take the example of Martanda Varma, who's from Shashi's...
My constituency.
You're part of your constituency, absolutely.
So, Martanda Varma...
Just 1 second. Were you aware of him?
Yes.
He was aware of it.
But I'm from the...
Yeah, other than if you happen to be from his constituency, you probably have heard of him. But Martanda Varma is not only a major character in Indian history, he's a major character in world history. Yeah. So he was the king of a very small kingdom in Vennard, later became Travancore. And he took on the Dutch East India Company, which in the early 18th century was the world's most powerful maritime force. It was much more powerful than the English East India Company. They'd taken over what is now Indonesia, they'd taken over Sri Lanka, they'd taken over southern Africa. And then they came up against this small kingdom led by Martanda Varma, and Martanda Varma defeated them in a place called Kolachal, just north of Kanyakumari, and completely destroyed them. As a result of which, I'm giving you this talk in English and not in Dutch. So, and after Martanda Varma, in fact, no Asian power would defeat a European power till 1905, when the Japanese defeated the Russians. So it was a major event. It caused the decline of the Dutch, who were then replaced by the French and the British and so on. So this was a major turning point, and no textbook in India ever mentions him.
And Kolachal, by the way, is in appalling condition. Now, I have been writing till I'm blue in the face to successive naval chiefs, Minister of Defense. The land on which it stands belongs to the Navy, but they're not doing what they should do with it because of some complication with the Tamil Nadu state government, since the Kanyakumari district has left Travancore and now gone to Tamil Nadu. And essentially, I mean, people are using this wonderful memorial to the greatest naval victory in Indian history as a urinal. I mean, they're basically using it to sort of vent themselves after a drink too many on the coastlines. It's a really sad story. It shows how little we appreciate our own history. And Sanjeev is very right to resurrect the story today.
You know, let's swing the time a few hundred years. You must have faced this counter argument about the various institutions left behind by the colonial era. We happen to be sitting in one of them, right?
Actually, this was created in reaction to the institutions of the colonial. This was the club for the Indians who were not allowed into the Bengal club.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It is absolutely, you know, it has very important intellectual pursuits, very interesting traditions, one of which, the dress code, has recently been violated by a mystic appearing in loincloth speaking in a debate. And there has been a suggestion that the dress code be changed to a loincloth and necktie. So we are waiting for the fresh circular to come out. I haven't seen one so far. So on that note, Shashi, what was, you've made a very passionate, you know, if I may say so, almost like a torpedo, you've hit at the railways, the education, the justice system. But do you think it was fair?
I was just going to point out that your president is wearing his loincloth around his neck, but maybe that was going one step too far. Sorry, your question was...
you've taken almost a single-minded hit at the remnants of the British institutions. You know, not remnants, they're still very much with us.
And your question is?
And the question is, do you think your unilateral pursuit of criticizing those institutions, was it fair, or was there both a debit and a credit side to that?
No, practically none. In fact, at the risk of encroaching on Sanjeev's fair share of the time, my book, An Era of Darkness, which actually was presented in more detail last night at Victoria Memorial, I don't know if any of you were there, makes a case in some detail against the British Raj, and then takes up, in turn, the various claims made for the British Raj by apologists for it, and dismantles them one by one. So it's a fairly extensive argument, and I can't do justice to it in answering Kunal's question except very briefly. But I would urge you all to look at it. Now, as far as the core argument is, the British came to one of the richest countries in the world. In fact, India was probably the second richest country in the world at that point. It had 27% of global GDP in 1700. By 1820, it was down to 23% of global GDP, but only China was ahead at that point with 27. So the British came to one of the richest countries in the world, conquered it, essentially and deliberately destroyed it, reducing it to one of the poorest countries in the world 200 years later. That's the core thesis. It's deeply substantiated. The destruction of Indian industries. We were the world's leading textile industry. We had the world's leading, we were the world's leading textile exporters as well. The world's leading shipbuilding industry. The world's leading steel industry, which is something I didn't know about until I started doing the research for the book. all of which were systematically destroyed by the British in the furtherance of their own aims. They also imposed extortionate taxation on Indians, created for the first time rural landlessness and rural poverty, essentially sent pretty much everything they could extract out of Indians back to England, financing the extraordinary monuments you see in London today, as well as the India's depredations paid for the industrialization of Britain in the Industrial Revolution. They were directly responsible for the deaths of some 35 million Indians in famines as a conscious result of British policy. And finally, they did all of this in the initial stages with very, very little effort to conceal their motives. They were in it for the money, and they took what they could, and they went back marveling at their self-restraint in not even stealing more than they had. I mean, you know, they took the word loot into their dictionaries as well as their habits from the late 18th century. From after what they called the Mutiny, the Indian Revolt of 1857, they changed their tune slightly in that the pretense that this was only a company coming here to trade was finally dispensed with the Crown officially taking over in 1858. But in fact, that was merely earlier. The Crown had been running the country, but masked through the agency of the directors of the East India Company. What happened essentially for 1858 was the advent of hypocrisy as a ruling principle in India, because the British started making completely insincere noises about ruling India for the benefit of the Indians, which had never been their intention in the past and remained not their intention thereafter. Because privately they would admit to each other this was all so much humbug, but they said it in order to justify their rule in the late enlightenment of the 19th century, and they continued the exploitation of India. And again, all this is amply documented, so you've got 30-odd pages of endnotes for those of you who are skeptical about my thesis. I then take up each of the various things, the institutions that Kunal refers to. For example, it is said that we benefit from the railways, omitting a few crucial facts. Number one, that the railways were built as a gigantic British colonial scam. They were actually introduced purely to serve the British purposes of exploiting the Indian hinterland, moving labor in to drag out more resources from India to the ports to be shipped to England. It was very, very much in the colonial interest to do it this way. They also built the railways entirely at Indian expense, but to the profit of the British. From about 1850 to 1875, the single most profitable investment you could make in the London Stock Exchange was to invest in the Indian railways, because they had guaranteed rates of return, irrespective of the amount of losses the Indian railways were actually suffering. And as a result, there was absolutely no concern about expenditure. And each mile of Indian railway built in that period in India cost 9 times the equivalent mile of railway being built in the US, UK, Australia, or Canada. So it was complete exploitation. Once they built it, they ran it completely in a racist manner, except for the most menial positions. Every job, including that of ticket collector and station master, had to be occupied by a European, a practice that continued right up to the First World War, when so many European males met their untimely ends in the trenches of the First World War that they finally had to reach out to non-Europeans. And even there they said, let's look for the most Europeans we can find in India, and that's how the Anglo-Indians became so identified with the railway enterprise. Yeah. And on top of that, when wagons were added, because Indians obviously wanted to travel on them and laborers had to be moved, these appalling third-class carriages with their wooden slats passing for benches, the Indian passengers paid the highest passenger rates of any railway in the world, while the British companies paid the lowest freight rates of any company, of any railway in the world. It was only after 1947 and Indians coming to freedom that finally whatever little was added to railway lines and so on was to facilitate the Indian demand for movement of passengers, where passenger rates were dropped, where freight rates were increased. Some would argue uneconomically increased to a point where now many prefer to ship our goods on trucks across the congested roads rather than by train. But still, the point is that the orientation of the railways to serve any Indian interests only happened after 1947.
Thanks.
So that's one example, and
Yeah.
we can go through each of them:
I know.
political unity, rule of law, the English language, tea, and even cricket if you want.
I mean,
and
just
in every
for-
case you'll see it was brought in by the British to further British interests and British control.
That's very poignant, Shashi. And just one more information about railways is that the construction of Indian railways is singularly responsible for the spread of malaria in India. Right. So that could be an addendum in the next edition. I'll give you the references because as they were digging up the lines and leaving a lot of stagnant water throughout the countryside, because malaria is actually a Spanish disease. Okay. That is where the name comes from, mal air. So malaria is a European disease imported in India. And much of malaria spread in India when the Indian railways were built because you were leaving large pools of stagnant water.
Which the mosquitoes bred.
Yeah,
because at that point they did not
yeah.
know the connection between mosquitoes and malaria. You're
Yeah.
quite right about malaria being assumed to do with bad air because the term actually came back to the Napoleonic conquest of Egypt.
It did, yes.
And one of the benefits of the Italians, by the way, of malaria was mozzarella.
Absolutely.
Because they did not realize that in areas where there were buffaloes, there was less malaria because the buffaloes were actually eating the mosquitoes, you see.
Exactly.
So not realizing why, because they did not know the mosquitoes were causing malaria, but they associated buffaloes with good air and less malaria, so they nurtured more buffaloes. And with all these buffaloes, they had all the surplus milk from which they started making mozzarella. That's how malaria gave us pizzas.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a fair amount of post-Renaissance literature about malaria, and all those diseases were later on thought to be tropical diseases. So they were not tropical diseases at all; they were all continental diseases. Now, anyway, on a nice on a nice holiday afternoon, we don't want to be you can't keep doctors away from diseases. You see, so that's how I make a living, unfortunately. So. Sanjeev, could you give us, in a nutshell, your view, because you have correctly projected the kind of maritime aspiration, powers of the Indian subcontinent, the highs and the lows, and you did point out to a period of decline when suddenly we were not there. So if you can give a summary of that perspective to our audience, that how we were in the Indian Ocean perspective, a kind of busy, trading, maritime kind of people. And did you see the continuity dropping off at some stage?
Yes, it's quite fascinating because, we don't associate India as being a great maritime nation. But in fact, for most of its history, it was one of the great maritime nations in the world. There are, of course, the world's largest Hindu temple is not in India. It's in Cambodia. You have Korean history starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. That is how Korean history starts, and that's how the history books even today mention it. Similarly, India had enormous amounts of trade with, in Harappan times, from the ports in Gujarat, trading with the Sumerians. The very first mention of an Indian outside of the subcontinent happens in Sumerian texts. This is at least 2500 BC or thereabouts. And it mentions a Meluhan, an Indian, in a court case where he is fined 10 silver coins for having broken the tooth of a local in a bar brawl. So that is one of the reasons, perhaps, given that that person was possibly most likely from Gujarat, perhaps one of the reasons we ended up with prohibition in Gujarat. Yes. Yeah. Now, this history then continues for a long time, and you have in the west coast of India trading with the Roman Empire, and there is a huge amount of trade going back and forth, so much so that you have Pliny and others complaining bitterly in the Senate in Rome.
We had a current account deficit.
With a current account deficit, and we were sucking in gold, and so much of gold, in fact, that the Roman Empire had a problem, that they didn't have enough gold to mint their coins. Sure. So ultimately, after attempting initially to ban trade and so on, which didn't work because the Indians were good at smuggling, what they did is began to reduce the amount of gold in their coins, which is debasing their currency. Now, what is interesting is what the Indians did in response. They continued to accept those coins, and they were very happy about the diminishing amount of gold in those coins because they could now more easily counterfeit them. So there are not only across the Indian Ocean lots of Indian Roman coins, but you also have the Indian counterfeits being found in archaeological sites across the Indian Ocean.
Can I just ask you something? we know what India was exporting all this while.
Yes.
Yeah? But what was India actually importing?
So we were exporting, as you know, spices, cloth, metals, and so on, iron particularly. But what were
Silks
we?
also.
Yes, sorry.
Silks.
Silks, and many other textiles and many other things.
Fine textiles,
Yeah,
fine
but,
cotton.
but
yeah.
to your question, what were we importing? So it turns out, once we have both from reading the texts and from amphora and other things that we have dug up at archaeological sites, the most popular imports were Italian wines, Greek olive oil, and good-looking women for the Raja's harems, which is very clearly and prominently mentioned in some of our in some of the texts.
Is that a fact?
Yes, it is a fact. And some of these things we were importing. Now, I don't know about the women bit, but certainly some of these were then taken onto the other coast and then exported out to Southeast Asia. So you have Roman products making their way ultimately even as far as the Chinese ports on the eastern ports of China. And they were not being taken there by the Romans, but by Indian merchants who were making their way all the way there. So they are actually remains of in Hindu temples built in the Tamil style all along the coast of China.
In fact, there's excavations going on right now near Cochin, the Pattanam excavations, where they found artifacts going back to the 1st century BC from China. So it's very clear that the Indian sailors were going all the way to China. And Sanjeev is right, they must have been selling some Indian goods, some goods that have come from their trade further west, from Sumeria, from Rome, etc., and then selling them to the Chinese and buying these things. So Chinese porcelain and so on. Actually, going back to 1st century BC is found in Kerala.
Actually, it's very interesting. You know, we again go back to Shashi's part of the world. I think we need to discuss Museri, is it?
Muziris. Or Muchiripatnam, which is what we call it.
Yeah. For a Bengali, we get a bit tongue-tied and all that. So tell us a bit about the potential of a port like Musiripatnam. What was happening over there?
So Muchiripatnam was the main port along the west coast. The main port on the east coast, by the way, is very near to here.
Is that a part of Kerala now?
Yes, very much. Just north of Cochin.
Yeah.
By the way, the largest port on the there are two large ports on the east coast. One of them is very near here, called Tamluk.
Yeah.
And these ports were serious places. I mean, the Roman manuals for trading mention Muziris very, very prominently as one of the great emporiums of the world and so on. And it's quite interesting, if you visit it even today, there is signs of this. So, for example, there was a very long-lasting Jewish community living there, and their synagogues are still around, although many of them now immigrated in recent times back to Israel. It was arguably the longest-running Jewish community in the world.
That never knew a single instance of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. It is also home, interestingly, to, if the dates are, there's some dispute about the dates, but if the dates are right, about the second oldest mosque in the world, which is roughly in the same area, by the way, and built in the lifetime of the Prophet.
Well, not quite built. What happened was that, a Kerala king actually, because these traders are coming from the Arab world all this time, and they brought the news of this new religion. As part of their established kind, one of the local kings was attracted by this in the lifetime of the Prophet, and decided he'll go off to...
I think he had not conquered Mecca yet.
He had not conquered Mecca, but see, there's some dispute about the exact date, but if that date is right...
But there are two bits of evidence. One is that he went there, and not only did he go there, but he took a lot of Kerala coconuts with him, which the poor chap died. He never made it back to Kerala, but he planted the coconuts, so that to this day, there are Kerala coconut trees growing along the coast of Oman near Muscat, which had been taken by this chap in the lifetime of the Prophet. So there's sort of visual evidence of this travel, because those trees are not indigenous to the Arab Peninsula. But the other thing is that he sent back messengers saying that he had liked this new faith and converted to it, and his followers should be allowed to worship and so on. And the local rulers had a disused temple. Now, the interesting thing about this is a temple that had already been disused earlier when Buddhism was on the rise. The Buddhists had worshipped there. The Buddhists had faded out, and the temple was just sitting more or less. So he said, in any case, it's a place of worship, you can have it. So this mosque in Kodugallur took over this old temple and started Muslim worship there. But dominating it to this day is a gigantic brass lamp, an ancient Hindu lamp, which the Muslims very cheerfully used as part of their worship in the mosque. It's one extraordinary thing, because today the Muslim League in Kerala refuses to light lamps at the beginning of functions, saying it's un-Islamic. And their own oldest mosque in India, and one of the oldest in the world, possibly, certainly the oldest outside the Arab Peninsula, is one which is still dominated by a big lamp.
And in fact, ironically, till the 1980s, the old structure of that old temple was still there. It's in the 1990s or 70s,
They changed it several times.
with money coming from the Gulf, that, you know, sort of domes and other things were added to the structure. So now if you visit it, it doesn't look like an old temple. But there is a photographic evidence and other things that within, you know, just a few decades ago, this was a completely different structure.
That's true, and there is a move now to try and revive the old structure, to renovate it again.
To get
it's
tourists.
controversial. There are two factions in the church, in the Masjid committee. But amongst the innovations, apart from all the Muslim sort of embellishments, is a digital clock that shows, in electronic terms, the 5 times of the namaz during the day. So it's quite next. So I would strongly recommend anyone interested to go and visit it. It's obviously one of the great things about the Islamic faith is anyone can visit. You don't have to be Muslim. I've been there. It's really worth a visit. Kodunallur is the place.
You know, Sanjeev, we have a feeling that you've actually been to most of the places you write about. Is that right?
Yes, I take the trouble. In fact, you know, while writing The Ocean of Churn, for example, I drove along the Kerala coast, down the Kerala coast, up the Tamil coast. I went all over Oman. I went to Zanzibar. Went to all these places in Southeast Asia. I live in Southeast Asia. I went all over Odisha. In fact, I attended something which is very pertinent to our discussion today, a festival called Kartik Purnima. And it is quite an interesting festival because it happens in the middle of November, and the tradition is that the women particularly, but children and everybody now, go out to a water body and put a small paper boat with a lamp. Now, people used to wonder why on earth is this custom carried out. But it turns out that it is a memory of the fact that in ancient times, this was the time when the merchants used to set sail for Southeast Asia. Because this is the time in November, you see, when in the full moon night, when the winds shift from blowing from the south to blowing from the north. So when they shift, this was basically the ritual by which the men folk were asked to, they went off on their thing, and the women folk would come and say goodbye, or the families would come and say goodbye. And even today, there is a fair that is held along with this festival of Kartik Purnima in Cuttack called Bali Yatra. Bali Jatra. Bali Jatra literally means the journey to Bali. So these things are still embedded, and unless you actually visit many of these places and physically see it, you simply miss the point of, no amount of reading books about these things will give you the feeling of this.
Fabulous. Now let's change gears a little bit. Shashi, it used to be said, I think, sometime during the Warren Hastings period, that you had about 2,000 British bureaucrats, whatever, governing a population of around 200 million. So somebody had actually made the comment that if each Indian took a fistful of sand and threw it at the British, that would be enough to bury the whole lot. How was this made possible? The oppression of so many by so few.
It's a very valid point, and in fact, in my book, I mention at one place with 3 different dates the maximum extent of British presence in terms of army officers and soldiers, commercial people, and administrators and / bureaucrats, and it never exceeded 1%. Or 0.1% of the population. So it really was quite startling that they were able to impose themselves so successfully. In the early days, of course, there was superior military technology, which included not only artillery and guns, but also techniques of warfare, so that larger Indian forces were routinely defeated by smaller British armies because they were outgeneraled by the Brits. European techniques of warfare had moved ahead. Ours, with our large lumbering forces, too many pack animals, massive tail to teeth ratio, big elephants, all of the stuff. Ours were much less efficient than the European system, so there was definitely military advantage, number one. But number two, and I think it's important, is our own disunity. Not only were we hopelessly divided and fragmented politically, despite nominal allegiance to a Mughal monarch, all of these Nawabs and Nizams and Rajas and so on were essentially autonomous to the point of independence. And so they weren't able to amass a united front on most occasions. On top of that, there was a tremendous Indian capacity for promoting self-interest above the collective interest, in other words, betrayal. So you find, for example, here in Bengal, Mir Jafar pays the British to put him on the throne in place of Siraj-ud-Dawla. Then Mir Qasim comes and pays the British to put him on throne in place of Mir Jafar. And after a few years, Mir Jafar comes back with more money and pays the British to put him on the throne. And the British are very happy to oblige because, as I said, they were in it for the money. Now, this is just a trivial example, but it's in a sense not that trivial because betrayal was a pattern right throughout. Even Tipu Sultan, for example, who, despite in the end a couple of reverses in the battlefield, had an impregnable fort at Srirangapatnam, which was surrounded by a moat full of water and crocodiles the British could not possibly encroach upon, and had secret passages through which supplies were brought in to the fort, so they were able to survive indefinitely. The only reason that fort fell and Tipu lost was betrayal, because one of his courtiers opened secretly a gate and allowed the soldiers, British soldiers, to come into the fort. And when my son was here, when he was a little kid, we went off to visit Tipu Sultan's fort at Sringapatnam, and the tourist guide said to us very pointedly, "Sir, second water gate Washington, first water gate Sringapatnam," because it was a water gate that was lifted to allow the British to come in and kill Tipu. So this betrayal, unfortunately, made a big difference to all of us as well. And once they had done it, the other thing that helped was the mercenary nature of Indian service. In the old days, and this is true everywhere in the world before the 19th century, patriotism wasn't the thing, right? You paid allegiance to a king or a ruler who hired you to fight his battles for him, and that was your profession, you did it. And that kind of got transferred from Indian rulers to the Brits. And then the soldiery were being true to their salt. They were sort of pursuing their profession in the service of these people who had hired them and who were paying them. And ultimately, they then became the enforcers of the British against their own kind.
Let's look at Vasco da Gama for a few minutes,
Okay.
Sanjeev. Yeah? Vasco da Gama, we got the impression, he was a little bit like a Father Christmas who walks into the Indian maritime coast, 1498 or thereabouts. But is it true that he was a nasty chap as well?
Absolutely. In fact, the Portuguese behaved pretty much like the Mongols behaved in Central Asia. The Portuguese behaved in the Indian Ocean world. In fact, the Goa Inquisition is one of the most horrific episodes in Indian history. Tens of thousands of locals were killed, Hindus and Muslims, but also, interestingly, Syrian Christians who were declared heretics by the Portuguese, who were Roman Catholic. And they gleefully documented all of this. So much of this you can actually go back and look at, because there is so much documentation of their own atrocities that they were carrying out. And there are horrible episodes where ships going to the Hajj were captured mid-ocean and set alight with everybody on it. And Vasco da Gama personally carried this out. And of course, the Inquisition was called in by none other than a gentleman called Francis Xavier, in whose name a school exists, to which I, Shashi, and possibly you also attended. So he was anything but a saint. But the point is, this was an absolutely horrible period in Indian history. Again, not remembered at all, but the Portuguese period is much better remembered, incidentally, in Southeast Asia, where also they carried out major massacres in Malacca and other places.
But I should say that when Vasco da Gama first showed up in Kerala, with these trinkets, Father Christmas would have really felt let down by Vasco da Gama as a brand ambassador, because he came with baubles and was sneered at the court, because, we were a land where extremely valuable and precious gems and so on were there. And in fact, people traveling, Vasco da Gama himself reported back to the monarch about the opulence of the city of Kozhikode, Calicut.
the Zamorin, was it?
The Zamorin.
Zamorin.
Samudri in Malayalam, but
Samudrin. Samudrin and Zamorin. Yeah.
But anyway.
but he came back with the cannons and then they didn't sneer.
So no, they threw him into jail because they said you can't try and pass off the stuff as valuables, and they threw him into jail for a couple of days. He left sober and came back with the cannons and killed a lot of people. Yeah.
I think, it would be a bit incomplete not to dwell on the Indian influences that we still see, or the Indic influences we still see persisting in places like Indonesia,
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean, I think it's baffling. World's largest Muslim country, right? With profound Indic influences. How do you... How
Absolutely. So in fact, you can't live in Southeast Asia without seeing it. I live in a city called Singapore, which Singhapura, the lion city. It literally means that. Indonesia, it's scattered with, and of course Bali is still a Hindu island, but even in the parts that are now Muslim or Christian, there is strong influence of India. In fact, if you go back and look at Indian texts from ancient times, it's quite fascinating. The Indian term for barbarian, or those who are outside the civilizational ambit, is mlecha, the word mlecha. And Indians, interestingly, never use the word mlecha for people of Southeast Asia, suggesting that ancient Indians used to consider them as part of their civilizational ambit. And by the way, this is not something that happened in ancient times. So when Indonesia becomes free of Dutch rule in 1949, what do? They name themselves Indonesia, which is clearly a reference to India. Their currency is the rupiah, which is actually the correct pronunciation more than ours.
Airlines is Garuda.
Their airlines is Garuda. National symbol is Garuda.
Their best-selling brand of clove cigarettes is called the Ramayana.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. They still do a Bhumi Puja before they build a house.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's quite extraordinary. And of course, they are the only Muslim population of any significance that did not succumb to Arab colonialism in terms of their naming practices. They still keep their Sanskritic Hindu-derived names while being good Muslims. So Subroto, Suharto.
No, you had the Prime
Meghavati
Minister.
Sukarnoputri.
Sukarnoputri.
In fact, somebody...
Meghavati Sukarnoputri is a Muslim.
Yeah. So in fact, somebody asked, an Indian, in fact, asked an Indonesian, senior Indonesian official about why is it that they continue to do this despite having converted to Islam. And he said, we have changed the way we pray, but we have not changed our ancestors.
Good thinking. Good thinking. Good thinking. I think that is really brought about the way you write about Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Actually, we are nearing the end of time, and we cannot risk any catastrophic hypoglycemia approaching 1:30. So you will have a little bit of time to interact. And if I may kind of pose a common closing question, is we've known of our history, we've known about the wrongs, the exploitation of the colonial era. How do we absolve ourselves of the way we have written, documented, and presented our history in the post-colonial period? Have we done ourselves justice? Shashi.
No, I don't think we have. And I've been making a bit of a fuss of this in some of my statements, because obviously, though the British had no intention of educating the Indian masses, the small sliver of Indians who were willing to educate were educated to serve the British colonial project. And so, as Macaulay's famous minute put it, the idea was to create this small class of interpreters between the governors and the governed, who would be, quote, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste and morals and opinions and in intellect, quote unquote. And that class was there to serve the British interests and not to challenge British rule. There's a wonderful academic study at Columbia University, which has established that the subject of English literature was invented to overawe the Indians. There was nowhere in the world, including England, was English literature studied until the colonial project required them to create a subject to hold Indians in thrall to the majesties of British literature. With the result that we study Shakespeare today, which I think is wonderful, but we don't study Kalidas. I was interested to hear Chitra mentioning Kalidas at the end of her earlier session. You know, perhaps only 5% of Kalidas's work has even survived. Unfortunately, we've been terrible at preserving ancient manuscripts and so on. But what has survived is of such magnificence that it is actually a crime that our children, that every Indian doesn't grow up with some familiarity with his work, even in translation. Similarly, while the Europeans studied the Odyssey and the Iliad in their schoolrooms, we never studied the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Now, we don't have to do this as part of a political Hindutva project, which I would personally stoutly resist, but as part of appreciating our own civilizational cultural heritage. Not, I think, as religious texts, but as texts steeped in the ancient past and to be read and studied in the context of their creation and the significance of what their lessons. So all of this we have missed out. And in many ways it's striking. Gandhiji, who initially said some odd things about how literacy wasn't terribly important and so on, actually turned around in the 1930s and came up with a scheme called the Wardha scheme of education, which he got some educationists to work with him at his ashram in Wardha. And it's somewhat ironic that we never actually took this up when we got independence 10 years later and tried to implement something that would have been far truer perhaps and to the basic needs of the Indians. And so much of our education is still strongly colonial and unfortunately still largely irrelevant to the challenges of Indian civilization, which is in no way to endorse the project of some to go to the other extreme. I mean, unfortunately, there is a movement in our country which, in their desire to instill pride in the past, has also discredited some of the great genuine achievements of ancient India by trying to peddle in the same breath some complete and utter fantasies like aircraft flying in the Vedic years and so on, which, you know, we've accomplished enough in our civilization to be genuinely proud of. The invention of zero, the founding of modern surgery by Shushruta, the extraordinary accomplishments of Aryabhatta, who anticipated Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, centuries before they had done their astronomical studies. The fact that the Rig Veda mentions gravitation, millennia before the apple fell on Newton's head. There's a lot there that you can actually talk about that is genuine and documented and not contested. But we have unfortunately got these cranks who are going around to places like the Indian Science Congress, making us all look ridiculous. And a prime minister who talks about Ganesha's head on a human body being proof of plastic surgery, which is an utter embarrassment. I'm sure that all of you doctors know that that's actually mathematical. The smallest elephant head couldn't fit on the largest human neck. So the whole thing is absurd to even... We actually did plastic surgery. Sushruta, actually, there is evidence of rhinoplasty in 1st century AD. But you don't mix it up with this kind of nonsense and look idiotic.
Yeah, Shashi, thanks. Actually, as a surgeon, we do feel tempted to swap the body and the brain at different occasions. But, perhaps not in that order. But are you aware of any second country in the postmodern era where both the education and the penal system was devised by the same man?
Well, I mean, devised is probably pushing it a bit. I mean, Macaulay wrote the Penal Code. In fact, he wrote it in 1837.
That's right.
And the British were themselves very, very dubious about the entire project and didn't enact it till 24 years later. An entire generation later, it was enacted in 1861. But the education system, it's hotly contested how much, that in many ways people say the thing was happening and Macaulay's bombast merely kind of became a window dressing for something that was already being decided at other levels. So whether he actually was the one who conceived the system is hotly contested. But many of his attitudes certainly have passed, and this whole business about, the entire literatures of India and Arabia are not worth a single shelf of English books and this sort of nonsense. And how all the languages of the East are irrelevant to the modern world and only English is. But of course we won't spend the money to teach the Indians this. We let them know they're useless languages, but they are useless. I mean, those attitudes are very much there.
So Sanjeev, your take on whether we've done ourselves justice in the historical narrative as we know it today.
This is 70 years after independence and we are still spending all our time claiming how bad the colonials were, where we have ample amount of time to have corrected all of this. And I agree with Shashi about there is more than enough stuff in our history that we can be proud of without having to get into flying chariots and so on.
Some people have said that Indian history is a record of all the wars we lost. It doesn't mention the wars we won.
Absolutely, and I mentioned Martanda Varma. But you see, one of the reasons we have this problem is that after independence, the Congress party that came to power was much more interested in trying to, wait, let me finish.
Have you seen Shashi this side?
Shashi is getting in.
Okay.
It's much more interested in trying to glorify a certain dynasty and trying to present the role of that one, their role in the independence movement. As a result of which, they wiped out of our history books the role other groups of people carried out to carry. For example, the revolutionaries.
Absolutely.
So whenever I bring up the issue about the revolutionaries, the impression that those defending the Congress will say that, yeah, there was some Bhagat Singh and some Netaji did something, but they were failures. Really? No, wait a minute.
Give him a chance.
I listened you out.
Yes.
Yeah. But the fact is...
You listened to me when I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, I know. Yes.
Yeah, so that's fine.
Give him a chance. Yes.
But the fact of the matter is that the revolutionaries were a very well-organized group of people over long periods of time with a very clear agenda. What were they trying to do? Basically, over 2 generations, they attempted to cause a revolt in the Indian armed forces because they clearly and correctly saw the Indian army as the source of British power, and they wanted to cause a revolt.
I mean, that culminates as a naval mutiny.
Yes, but it starts out in the First World War with the Ghadar movement.
Ghadar, yeah.
And they fail in doing that. The Sachindranath Salyal and Raj Bihari Bose do this. Raj Bihari Bose runs away to Japan. But they were not a small group of people. They actually had an embassy in Berlin in those years. During the interwar years, they, of course, there was something called the Hindustan Republican Army that worked. And then, of course, there was the INA, which, by the way, was set up by Raj Bihari Bose. Same person who tried to do the Ghadar movement, came back, set up the INA in Singapore. He handed it over to Netaji. And then...
Well, before that, in the First World War, there was the Provisional Government of Free India.
Yes.
Headed by Barkatullah Khan in Kabul.
Yes, and
with a Malayali Prime Minister.
And Mahendra Singh and so on.
A Malayali Foreign Minister.
Yeah.
He had a Hindu Prime Minister and a Malayali Foreign Minister.
Yes, and then, of course, it all culminated, and they succeeded ultimately with something called the Naval Revolt of 1946, which is not a minor issue. If I actually grew up as an adult, found out about the Naval Revolt of 1946, again, wiped out of our history books. But in fact, it was no small event. In that event, something like 20,000 sailors revolted. They took over some 80 ships in Bombay Harbor, and these guys were not, new guys. They were war veterans.
And they fired onto Bombay.
They had guns.
Onto the port.
They knew what they were doing. The Indian Army and the Air Force refused to attack them, and they had a complete revolt on their hands. That is the moment at which India became independent. And it had everything to do what the revolutionaries were trying to do right from the beginning. But all of this has been wiped out of our history books.
Well, let me offer a mild correction. Obviously, all these facts are available to both Sanjay
you have to be tolerant of him, because
I'm very tolerant. That's my problem.
You're a tolerant person, but you see the tendency towards a matrilineal society is historical, isn't it?
Yes.
So don't just blame the Congress for it. It's been, it's in our genes somewhat. The AIDMK, the Congress, etc., etc. What do you think, Shashi?
Now, let me just briefly agree and disagree with Sanjeev. I agree with him, by the way, that the Naval Mutiny deserves more telling in our story, because the larger issue of the revolutionary attempts in India were that they were made and they were always futile. That in every single case, the overweening power of the British was such that our revolutionaries could never succeed, and most of them met very sad and premature deaths. I mean, the hanging of Bhagat Singh at the age of 22, barely, 21 and a bit, was such a great loss. But what had he done? He'd done something utterly foolish, throwing a bomb in... Khudiram Bose exactly was 18, you're quite right. The 4 conspirators here who were killed, including that lovely lady. Forgive me, the name escapes me for the moment, but he may be right that it escapes me because I never studied it like a catechism. BBD Bagh, of course, is named for revolutionaries. But then look at a brilliant man like Aurobindo, Ackroyd Ghosh, who, realizing the his futile and unsuccessful attempt to use arms to overthrow the British, flees off to Pondicherry and becomes a sage. So ultimately, it was very clear those methods weren't working, and that anyone who tried them ended up, in the early days, being blown from the mouths of British cannons, in the later days being hanged or sent off to Andamans and so on. So in many ways, one could argue that the Congress's methods, Gandhiji's great insight was, here was an empire that could be shamed by its own conduct. And that's why his techniques, including inflicting fasting on himself and all that, actually worked with the British as they could not have worked with the Hitler or Mussolini, whereas the bombings and the revolutionary attempts failed with the British simply because the imbalance of power was so great. Now you finally come to the Naval Mutiny, and that's where I joined Sanjeev. Up to there, I part with him for these reasons. But in 46, the British were already exhausted by the Second World War. London had been bombed to smithereens. They were suffering huge shortages. There was a massive war debt to America and even to India. The British owed us 125 million pounds sterling in those days' money. This was an economy on its knees. And on top of that, they had this naval revolt, and they said, can we afford, and is this a priority for us to spend the kind of money it would take to keep this bunch of people under our jackboots anymore? So if it weren't for the exhaustion of World War II, I'm afraid the naval mutiny would have not succeeded in getting the British to decide to give up, because it was quelled by a combination, by the way, of Indian political leaders persuading the mutineers to lay down their weapons, as well as by the
Yes,
I
but
think, ma'am, thank you very much. That will be a topic of discussion in another forum. And I'm sure Malavika has taken good notes on everything that we've discussed today. I think that deserves a lot of discussion. Having said that, we'll have a closing minute from you, Sanjeev. Do you have your kind of panoramic take home on what we've discussed today?
Yeah, I mean, it's about time that we begin to rewrite our history, and I agree that you can't have, random jingoism based on no evidence. Shashi and I may disagree on a few issues, but I think we agree basically that the textbooks need to be rewritten. It's about time to get rid of these old biases and so on. And when we do it, we need to be very clear about what the evidence is. It has to be an evidence-based approach, not an ideological approach, which is what has gone on so far. Secondly, I think one of the interesting things that we need to do is that history is not just political history. There are other kinds of history too. There's the history of science. There's also the history of geography and evolution of urbanization and so on. There are all kinds of other histories that we also need to bring into the story.
Thanks, Sanjeev. Shashi, did you get that £1 reparation you've been asking for?
No, that was really because the Oxford topic required reparations.
Right.
I think that we're barking up the wrong tree on that simply because...
and what would be your synopsis?
Well, I would say atonement, and that would be in two forms. One is very simply an apology. I've talked about in the past and in the book about how Willy Brandt, the Chancellor of Germany, went to Poland in 1970 and sank to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto to apologize. And Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, has apologized to India for the Komagata Maru ship being turned away from Vancouver and many of its people meeting a grisly end at the hands of the Brits and so on. So yes, an apology would go a long way, and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which was possibly the single worst atrocity, which encapsulated all the brutality and racism and wanton cruelty, as well as self-justifications of the British Raj in one episode, that would be a great time for a member of the royal family or a Prime Minister of Britain to come here and go on their knees in Jallianwala Bagh in apology. I think that would go a very, very long way. I mean, that was not only the killing of men, women, and children. A lot of children were shot to death. But it was also, the Daya wouldn't allow people to tend to the dead and the dying or the wounded lying on the ground. People were 24 hours of rotting in the sun. You had Indians forced to crawl on their bellies on a street, and then if they lifted their heads, they were hit on the heads by lathis. Then, after all of this, money was collected by the British to reward Daya for his abusive behavior, for his psychopathic behavior, and the equivalent of £250,000 in today's money was given to him, along with a bejeweled sword. And Rudyard Kipling, that flatulent voice of imperialism, called him the man who saved India. I mean, this was the appalling celebration of cruelty that the British indulged in. So there could be no more fitting occasion than Jallianwala Bagh centenary for an apology. The second thing the British should do is teach colonial history to their children. They have gone in for this convenient historical amnesia where all of this is brushed under the carpet, whereas television and so on shows all these rose-tinted romantic things about Indian summers and the far pavilions, and they don't actually in any way confront this. The week my book came out in India, by utter coincidence, a British-based Pakistani journalist wrote an article in The Guardian about having raised 2 children and sent them to the best public school in Westminster. As you know, it's a private school, Westminster, where they'd majored in history and never learned a line of colonial history. That's the way the British are. I mean, London is littered with museums. Have you ever seen a museum to the colonial period? Nothing at all. I mean, you got the Imperial War Museum, which celebrates the victories of the British, but there's nothing actually revealing all of this. So yesterday night at the Victoria Memorial, I made a public appeal, with which I wish to end here, urging you. I made a public appeal that the Victoria Memorial should be converted to a museum of colonialism in India. It should be converted to display all the atrocities, all the processes of colonialism, so that our children can actually go to this otherwise beautiful building, this magnificent monument to the excesses of the Raj, and witness and learn for themselves all that was done to India during 200 years of British rule. I think that would be a fitting monument in this city, the old colonial capital.
Shashi, thank you very much. I think that is a project well worth thinking about and taking it up. The only risk is, in contemporary times, anything in Bengal ends up being a festival. Yes. So, anyway, on that note, I think we need to introspect, and probably the message I take back home with me is, for you and me, for the young and for the young of this country to plan the life and the road ahead, a good considered look in the rear view mirror is well worth it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Calcutta Literary Festival. We enjoyed having the session with all of you. Thanks.
And thanks to the moderator for your very witty and learned moderation. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjeev.
Just a quick note, Dr. Tharoor and will be very happy to sign books at the book counter. Sanjeev? And Sanjeev will also be there. May I just now request Mr. Basu, Shubroto Basu from the club, to say a few words.
Ladies and gentlemen, how do we thank Dr. Tharoor or Mr. Sanyal? They've absolutely enthralled us. So please put your hand together and thank them. And of course, we can't stop thanking our very own Dr. KUNAL SARKAR for having wonderfully conducted this show. My thanks also go to the Kolkata Literary Meet for having organized this, and to Tata Steel for having been supportive of this program. Thank you very much.